Well, Professor Wax, it's an honor to speak with you. I think it's the first time I'm communicating with you. You're a professor of law at University of Pennsylvania. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, my pleasure.
I'd like to start with an absurdity, if I could. About a year and a half ago, you were invited to speak, I think, at Heterodox Academy East Asia. And I had gotten the message I wasn't able to attend, but I knew about it particularly because after the fact, or before the event happened, some very, very woke academics in the United States said you shouldn't be invited, shouldn't be platformed because you're a racist and so forth. But what was fascinating is that none of them apparently showed up to the meeting to talk to you about all of these awful things, and they never gave any examples of why you were a racist and a fascist and so forth. And it reaffirmed to me why I gave up on the American humanities a long time ago. And maybe you have too, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what seems to me to be the absurdity of coming at you with ad hominem attacks and then not showing up to debate you at all about these things that allegedly happened. Is American academia kaput, or is there some hope that it might be recovered?
Well, I'm very bearish. No, bearish means pessimistic, right? About American academia, given what I've seen of it.
Hmm.
And I have seen it evolve over, 20 plus years that I've been teaching. And then, of course, I went to college, went to Yale, went to Columbia and Harvard Law School, so I've been inside the beast for quite a while and the elite part of the beast. And I have seen a deterioration that has now turned into a nosedive. I mean, gradually and then suddenly, as Hemingway would say,
Hmm.
of moving away from reasoned discourse, engaging with the people you disagree with, doing the hard work, and it is hard work
Right.
of arguing your points, mustering your evidence, and treating your opponents with a certain degree of civility. You don't have to like them, or, of course, you don't have to agree with them, but just engaging in a rigorous, objective, evidence based, argument based way with what they have to say, that is really gone out the door.
Hmm.
And what has replaced it is, as you suggest, lots of name calling, ad hominem attacks, and the like. And of course, it's easy uh, to throw out ad hominem labels and accusations. That's really easy. It's hard, very hard to make your case. I've known that since I was an undergraduate at Yale, because I took some courses in which I disagreed with the point of view of the professor
Right.
and faced the challenge at the age of 19, 20 of trying to, convince people that I was right. And I really had a revelation at that time that being, any kind of disagreement or dissent really is hard work. And, you need to really put your nose to the grindstone about that. But my students, well, my fellow professors, some of them still seem to understand that, although their arguments are getting, less and less rigorous and convincing, and full of political correctness and assumptions that are unjustified. And the students are hopeless, with few exceptions. I mean, there are exceptions,
Hmm.
but the education that they're getting from kindergarten on
Hmm.
does not promote that sort of exercise. It claims to, and that's part of the gaslighting that's going on here,
Right.
of course, which is just everywhere. Um, but they're not doing it, and they're not very good at it. And they think just calling someone a racist is enough. And of course, these terms are very muzzy, They're not defined, they're not precise. I've been called every name in the book. And even by, the top brass in the universities. I
Mm.
was recently sent a draft of the reprimand that Penn had proposed to issue to the entire world in their complaint against me, their formal complaint against me, which has been going on for years now, because it was sort of coming to an end, by the provost of my university.
Mm.
And as I was joking the other night at a presentation, you know, it it bears a striking resemblance to something that a not very bright middle schooler in Wichita, Kansas would write before her parents went over it. I mean, it was so crude. It was so ad hominem. It was so unreasoned. I thought it was an embarrassment. I would be embarrassed to write something like that or release something like that, but that's considered okay. She's a racist, she's a sexist, she's a homophobe, she's engaged in inequitably targeted disrespect, whatever the hell that is. She's unfit to teach, blah, 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 blah. No reasons, no examples, none of the usual stuff that you would expect.
I think I might have lost you there for a second. Are you are
This
you
is
there?
very disappointing. I've given you a very long answer here, but I think I will stop. Um, and it wasn't that way when I started out. People say, what was Yale like for women back in 1971 when I got there, which is ages and ages ago? I said, it was great. It was so much better than today. And I know because my son graduated from Yale not all that long ago, and we compare notes, and I can tell you it's been downhill.
I wonder if I think the first time I ever heard your name was quite some time ago, and it was over the kerfluffle over bourgeois values. And I remember thinking at the time, I couldn't believe that anybody would be against bourgeois values. It
They
seemed
are.
something that I thought everyone's mother taught them in kindergarten. This goes back to your point about it's not just the academy, but perhaps the wider culture. It's perhaps no one is learning bourgeois values anymore. I live outside the United States. I don't really know, but I remember being shocked that anybody could be against waking up in the morning, putting on a suit and tie, going to work, paying one's bills, pulling up one's pants, perhaps. Uh, maybe there's something beyond the academy. Maybe the entire culture is collapsing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, I think what starts in the academy, doesn't end in the academy
Mm.
because the academy is, a stronghold of this kind of left-leaning blue state elite. And they learn a lot of their attitudes in the academy and then bring it out into society. I think a lot of that is happening as more and more of our population is being college educated,
Right.
which is a trend that really I think has had some truly pernicious effects.
Mm.
But you talk about putting on a suit. Well, I mean, Steven Pinker talks about the casualization of society. That's considered oppressive and constraining and patriarchal, and we could just go through the whole litany of what's bad about it. I mean, I think it's great. I think men look great in suits. I think people look much worse now than they did even in the 50s, right?
Mm.
You see the newsreels of the 50s, people look fantastic, right? Well, for one thing, they're thin, so we'll start there. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think Charles Murray has put his finger on it, and also a guy named Rob Henderson. The elites do not preach what they practice. They're actually pretty bourgeois in their habits and in the way they conduct their lives. Certainly their family life, their personal life, their financial life,
Right.
or they wouldn't be where they are,
Right.
which is at the top of the heap,
Not in
top of the food
Fishtown.
chain.
Right.
Right, it's the Fishtown versus Belmont problem, but they refuse to sort of advocate for that, and they harbor and express these kind of refusenik, anti-establishment, you know, bohemian beliefs. And Rob Henderson says, you know, those are luxury beliefs
Right.
because they're inflicting them on people lower down on the pecking order who really can't afford to give up on these bourgeois habits, which help people, you know, get ahead, have a decent life, um, and uh, have nice things, which the elites take for granted. Now, in partly that's because they kind of segregate themselves in these strongholds, highly, you know, white, I call them whitopias, that are very expensive, that are low in crime. And they look around and say, oh, everything's great, you know? And diversity is wonderful, even though their lives are not diverse. But these are the luxury beliefs, and family structure can be anything you want it to be, and there are no limits. People can be whatever they want to be. Um, the obsession with racial equality, which requires a lot of social control and distortion for various reasons that they don't really have to live with directly.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, I thought it was laughable and absurd that my colleagues were all up in arms because I had advocated for bourgeois values and then added that not all cultures are, you know, equally good at promoting these good habits, and we ought to recognize these differences.
Mm.
Now, you know, none of my colleagues really believe that all cultures are equivalent. I mean, they don't. You only have to say, well, what about the Taliban, you know? But they won't engage on this sort of thing. They won't engage. They just shun me, and I'm not worth talking to. All of my ideas are fringe. That's what my former dean said. My activities are fringe. The people I talk to are fringe. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, one of my colleagues said, is a right-wing subversive fringe organization, which
Mm.
is crazy.
Mm.
You have to understand what's going on here. It's just it's really surreal. It's surreal.
It feels like it from 7,000 miles away. And this word fringe, I've heard this so many times. I'm sure I've been called fringe before. Uh, a friend of mine, it might be a mutual friend, Mark Ramsire at Harvard Law, he and I wrote a book together about a very esoteric minor bit of East Asian history. And he and I were called Holocaust deniers. The book has nothing to do with the Holocaust. We've never denied the Holocaust. We never would deny the Holocaust. We were called
Is this
Holocaust,
about comfort women?
the comfort women, right? The
Yes,
comfort.
I read about that book, and I know Mark. He's an acquaintance of mine, so yeah, I've
And
corresponded with him.
we were quite shocked to be called Holocaust deniers. He was called a white supremacist. We were called racist and fascist and so forth. And I'm sure we were called fringe. And we figured out that all of these things are ways of, as you said, shunning us. They're ways of ostracizing us. And I wonder, to build on that point a little bit, when people like yourself are called fringe, everything is fringe, everyone is fringe. Is there even a politics at all left in the academy? I mean, it seems right. It seems left wing, the way that people act. It seems to me very, very left wing and Marxist and Stalinist and so forth. But the Marxists, the Stalinists, at least the ones that I used to know in academia, they would debate me. We would have
Sure.
we would have knockdown, drag out debates over capitalism and whatever the big idea was. But to call someone fringe and say they're a Holocaust denier and then slam the door in their face, it doesn't strike me as political at all. It strikes me as kind of a kindergarten move. And this is something I think you've brought up before too, that we're living in sort of a kindergartenish world. Is there a politics at all? I mean, is this a left-wing phenomenon or is this just a kind of childishness?
Well, I think it is a left-wing phenomenon, and they have adopted a kind of childish, feminized approach
Hmm.
through the feminization of the academy. I've talked about the substitution of,
Right.
conventional, traditional standards in the academy of the ethos of the nursery and the kindergarten, which is really what has happened, I
Hmm.
think, and it does involve a kind of infantilization. But you have to understand that the ordinary kind of discourse that even Marxists were embraced, and some of them still do actually, the old style ones, has been replaced by woke ideology.
Hmm.
And one of the precepts of woke ideology is kind of postmodern, which says that these standards, these practices of engaging with reason and analysis and argumentation and evidence and all of that, better arguments, worse arguments, all of these conventions, which are hard won, have been hundreds of years in the making, of course, from the point of the Enlightenment on. Uh, all of that is just part of this oppressive structure of, oppressor putting down oppressed, the boot in the face, denying, the othering of different ways of seeing. I'm not very good at sort of, elaborating on this woke nonsense, but I am exposed to it all the time.
Hmm.
And it's a ideology that dismisses, merit, reason, argument, all of that as just a cover for power relations,
Hmm.
a cover for power relations,
Hmm.
and that sort of thing. So, they have a great answer to, we don't need to engage with that.
Hmm.
We don't need to do that. That just cedes too much power to the other side. And the denigration of ordinary indicia of merit, even the ability to, do arithmetic or read and write, the basics, as kind of irrelevant. And of course, any measure or test of intelligence or competence or ability or performance, all of that is once again a cover for the powerful, the patriarchy, white supremacy, etc.
Hmm.
Because frankly, you know, not without exception, but whites are pretty good at that stuff. You just have to look at the societies they've created, um, and we can't allow that. So that's why it has, declined, I think. Now, having said that, there are people in the academy, especially the older generation who are on their way out, who still cling to these older practices and values,
Hmm.
but they keep their head down and they don't want to fight the fight. This is a big disappointment to
Hmm.
me, frankly, because I am, one of these older academics, and I have elected to fight the fight. There were more people like me, I think it would be a very good thing, but it's costly.
Hmm.
Um, I'm lucky because I'm nearing the end of my career. I'm financially secure. My children are grown. I'm in the best position to stand up to this. But there are a lot of other academics who are in my position.
Hmm.
But they don't want to lose their friends. They don't want to be unpopular. They don't want to be shunned by the students because I am shunned by the students. Not all of them. I have what I call my hardy band who take my classes and reach out to me. I'm regularly reached out to by students at my own university
Hmm.
who email me. Can we have coffee? Can we talk? I really want to talk to you about some of the things you've said, about some of your ideas.
Hmm.
They realize they've been sold a bill of goods.
Hmm.
They realize that they've been indoctrinated from day one.
Hmm.
And they're starting to think, wait a second, isn't there another point of view? Yeah, there's the whole deplorable world out there, which, according to, the powers that be in academia, well, it only exists as an evil force. That's it. To be, defeated and stamped out, not as set of points of view to be engaged or respected in any way. And there is just a vigilant effort against, what people like Steve Saylor call crime think.
Mm.
And that's why they've gone after me,
Mm.
because I dare to engage in crime think, and there are students who respond to me, and that is really scary to them. That is subversive. There aren't that many,
Mm.
because they have to be very tough and courageous. I mean, there are actually dozens, but relatively speaking, there aren't that many.
It's almost a missionary now at this point for someone like you or someone who is a dedicated educator. It's almost a missionary field to be reaching out to students who in some way realize that they've been sold a bill of goods, a very expensive bill of goods in the case of universities today.
Very.
The
And
very
some have
expensive.
been to private school, like these fancy private schools. Their parents have spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars on their so-called education.
It's almost, you bring up a really good point about the personal cost. I saw this with my friend Mark Ramsire when he bucked a very minor trend in some remote field of history, and for 3 years he got death threats. He lost friends. Uh, his people in his university went after him. It was like I could see it from afar, and it was awful. It's a personal cost, like you say, and I, I've been thinking lately. People talk a lot about freedom of speech and freedom of expression and academic freedom, but those are not abstract concepts. Those are battles that have to be won, fought, and there are very few people who walk the walk. You're one of them. We got a lot of messages of support from people who said, I support you and good luck, but very few people were walking the line with us when it was incoming fire. It's a different world out there when you're fighting the fight.
Very few people within the academy, because it's just so costly. And, the costs that I've detailed, it's lonely, it's upsetting.
Hmm.
Nobody wants, to lose friends, and I've lost friends, but then I've gained friends too. I've had people in my neighborhood, for example, just come up to me and say, "Come over to our house for dinner." There's a number of, it's a very blue, upscale neighborhood, but there are people who actually agree with me.
Hmm.
But of course, they pay a cost too. So one funny thing that's happened in my neighborhood, um, which is once again this very expensive Whitopia outside of Philadelphia, is one guy hung outside his house a Trump flag, dared to do that,
Brave
a
man.
big one, and people leave their dog poop bags under the flag. So what do we have here? If you disagree with me, I'll shit on your lawn. I mean, that's really where we are right now in the United States of America. Even among the most sophisticated people, that is the response that they think is appropriate. I mean, I have to laugh about it, as sad as it is.
Yeah. It,
So who wants dog shit left on their lawn, right? By their neighbors? Well, no sensible person. So I think yeah, I'm not gonna, this is not, I hope, a humble brag, but you have to show courage.
hmm,
Courage, that is a virtue. That is an Aristotelian virtue,
it is.
right? And it is, I say to people, this is one of the items of my indictment. I say to students, there's a reason they call it a culture war,
Hmm.
right? And let me tell you, in wars, people get hurt.
Yeah.
And they interpreted that as some kind of threat on my part.
Goodness.
So it's one of the items at my hearing that was said, "Do you believe she said there's a culture war and in a war people get hurt?" Well, I was trying to warn my students that people get hurt.
Right.
if
You do get
if you
hurt. Yeah.
join the side you're on, if you come out and join the side you're on, then people will attack you. Just get over it.
It's a very strange thing. I mean, you've mentioned before in some of your talks and your writings about safetyism. These people are they the people that go after you, me, Mark Ramsar, anybody who disagrees with anybody on anything. They they have very violent rhetoric. They go after the person directly, and they seem to have no problem with attacks on people's property. The man with the Trump sign is a perfect example of that. I'm sure they would do worse if they thought they could get away with it. But at the same time, these people cower behind these sorts of ridiculous
Right.
fantasies about violence directed towards themselves. And obviously, the obvious meaning of that statement is people get hurt in a culture war, meaning if you take a stand on something, if you stand up, people will come after you. That's the obvious meaning. But they twist it to mean Professor Wax is threatening students with violence and so forth.
Right.
So on
Which
the
is
one hand,
absurd.
they're 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 fine with violence towards people with whom they disagree, but they cower, the cry bullies, I guess you can call them. What's the end game of all this? I mean, I'm watching the United States fall apart from thousands of miles away. It is the end game just violence, or is there a way we can steer back to where people talk to
Well,
one
I hope not. I hope not. I really hope not. And I pray not. But I think you have to understand that only certain people are entitled to safety.
right?
That's,
Right.
the sacred categories of people are entitled to safety. And if you threaten their psychological safety, then you need to be attacked. But your psychological safety means nothing. I actually use this, I think, to good effect in my seminar on conservative thought. Because one of the rules I have in my seminar is, you can be offended. You can sit there and be offended by something you've read or something somebody else says, but you just can't say that you're offended. That's a rule. So it's not a 100% free speech zone. And I say, let me tell you something. Every morning when I open the New York Times, which is a bad habit that I really need to get over, I am offended. I am offended by the lies, the half truths, the gaslighting, the editorializing under the guise of news, the ideology. I'm offended. I'm constantly of the way that it misrepresents people that I know. I could go on and on.
Right.
And you know what? I tell the students, nobody cares that I'm offended. Nobody cares. And that's the way it should be. Nobody should care.
Mm,
Because in a democracy where people are going to disagree,
mm,
you are going to end up offending people, upsetting them.
mm.
They're going to be mad. They're going to say, no, 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 that's wrong. That's the lifeblood of democracy. And we are not schooling people in that lifeblood of democracy. So I say, I don't want to hear that you're offended because it doesn't advance the ball. It doesn't help us, weigh the arguments and figure out the merits of what people are proposing.
Right.
Um, Last year I had, uh, well, I mean, oh my God, I'm revealing what happened in my seminar. I had a group of students who actually had some military experience, and they came together and presented their case that there should be no women in the military.
Mm,
And they said, there's no other class that we could do this in.
mm.
And some of the stories they told were pretty hair raising, actually. Um, but I'm sure that in my school, many people would be offended by that very thought.
Mm.
But it's too bad.
Anybody who
It's
has
too
a
bad.
daughter or a sister, I think, would be against having women in the military. Anybody who had any inkling of what goes on a battlefield, what could happen to women in the event that they're taken prisoner, I think it's just common sense to be against sending women into combat.
Oh, well, it isn't even that. It's that the fraternization in the military that is, technically forbidden, of women sleeping with everybody at the top of their command, everybody at the bottom, and in between. I mean, just has a
Mm.
devastating effect,
Right.
right? Single motherhood is really the military and its readiness takes a huge hit from trying to deal with single moms
Right.
who, struggle to be battle ready and also take care of their kids on their own. Um, there's all sorts of issues before you even get into the combat risks.
Right.
Uh, these are not to be spoken of. These are not to be talked about. Uh, and if you want to get ahead in the military and rise through the ranks, you can't talk about this stuff.
Wow.
Yeah. So, where can the students hear about this and weigh it and evaluate it? Nowhere.
I, I know you're very busy, so just two very quick final questions, and I think they're related. I I was watching from afar universities descend into I couldn't believe my eyes. I saw people calling for the extermination of the Jews on college campuses in the United States, in New York City, California. I I knew colleges were bad. I went to an American university long ago. I knew they were very bad. I knew they were filled with angry little punks who fantasize about violence, but I never expected to see the kind of ugly calls for really, I mean, hurting people, exterminating them on college campuses. And then you mentioned about courage being an Aristotelian virtue. It seems that it takes a lot more courage now to be on a college campus as anyone who disagrees with anything than it did when I was there. What what's coming on college campuses in the new semester? Are we going to get more of the same kind of hate and violence? And where do students find courage? Is this in their background, their religious tradition? Do they find it in friends? Where do you get the courage to speak up?
Well, I don't know what's going to happen. And I think, I don't know what the position of Jewish students is going to be versus people who are very critical of Israel to the point of, advocating for essentially the abolition of Israel, which some people have done.
Right.
I think the causes of that are complex. The people who are calling for that, they're not necessarily just from MENA, Middle Eastern backgrounds. There's also a lot of, you know, people of European origin and the like.
Mm.
So it's part of the leftist ideology of oppressor and oppressed. Successful people are oppressors by definition. Israel is a very successful Western nation. Um, but, in terms of calls for the abolition of Israel, which is basically death to the Jews, right? Which is not a direct threat to kill Jews, but just an advocacy for that happening. And that is an important distinction under the First Amendment, and I
Mm.
point that out. I'm a First Amendment hawk, right? I think private universities could punish calls for genocide if they wanted to, because they don't have to adhere to the First Amendment,
Right.
which is very strict about what is, can be forbidden,
Right.
only direct threats of violence. But a lot of them have said, well, we adhere to the First Amendment, which means, as someone like Liz McGill, who's no longer my president, said to Congress, it's complicated. Well, actually, it is complicated. I mean, she was a loser, but that part of what she said is true. And what I say to my students who say, that's horrible, that should be punished, that's anti-Semitism, is I say, yeah, it's pretty horrible, but frankly, don't you want to hear what these people have in mind and what they have to say?
Mm.
Don't you want to know their intentions and their positions?
Mm.
Maybe it will influence your immigration policy. Maybe you'll think, oh, we really should not be importing a lot of people from the Middle East or from the third world because they're extremely anti-Semitic, these people. Maybe that's not good for our nation.
Interesting.
Um, maybe, I mean, it might change, or that's the reality of what Palestinians really want, which frankly I think is true. I think most Palestinians would like to see Israel wiped off the face of the earth. And to the extent that the mainstream media denies that, they're gaslighting us. So let's hear it. Let's hear it from their own mouth. So I'm giving all the arguments for why we should hold our nose, show some courage, and let people say what they really think, as long as they're not directly threatening violence at the moment. And that's the First Amendment doctrine, and it's wise, okay? The Supreme Court has done a great job, I think, in interpreting the First Amendment and understanding what it's there for. The First Amendment is there so that we can get at the truth and the reality and not fool ourselves about where people stand. So, I mean, what is going to happen? I can't predict, but this is the position that I have taken. Obviously, that doesn't forgive occupying buildings, building encampments, obstructing, people's access to class. None of that should be allowed. It should be strictly forbidden and punished,
Right.
much more strictly than it is now, right? But just speaking and expressing your political view, we have to allow it. We let these people in. Now we have to hear what they have to say.
Interesting. It's a very courageous position. Thank you very much for making the time to talk to me. Excuse me. Pardon me. I'm getting over a cold. I won't give it to you over Zoom, I promise.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I'm going to get into ever more trouble for everything I've said here. But
well, I hope not. I hope.
Oh, I will. I don't care. I don't care. I think they're kind of becoming kind of exhausted in accusing me of so many things, but I hope so.
You wore them down. That's a very brilliant strategy.
I don't know if I have. I don't know. But anyway, thank you for interviewing me.
Thank you. I admire you very much, and I'm pulling for you from far away. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.